What's
Yes.
the temperature there today? Hey.
Oh, hey. Uh, that's a great question. I haven't been outside.
Yes, of course. I was
Um,
outside early this morning. I left my house at 47 this morning.
it's, it was cold overnight. It was legit cold overnight. It was like down in the 40s. It's 70 right now, but yeah, when I took the trash out last night, it was like proper cold.
Oh, we're at like 66 today right now. So pretty nice. I'm glad to be wearing a cardi. It's cardi
Hey.
season.
Speaking of Cardi, more voice news. John Legend had one of his team perform Cardigan, and this is going to sidetrack us from our intro, but hi everybody, you're going to listen to me talk about our love of Taylor Swift for 10 seconds. There's this young kid who was singing it, and he was like grew up listening to what did he say, like Dylan and a bunch of other people, and he was like, so I got a real sense for like literature driven songs or something, kind of like intellectual songwriting. And then he was like, so I was real skeptical of this Taylor Swift song. And I was like, boy, don't you come for Taylor Swift. She is a lyrical genius. And then like he got to like one line in the song and he was like, and then I was like, oh, maybe I underestimated the song. I was like, underestimate Taylor Swift at your peril, young man.
At your peril, young man. At your peril.
She is a lyrical genius. That's all I wanted to tell you and Jay. Hi, Jay. We can do the intro now.
All right, welcome to October 19th, everybody. We still don't know how it got here, but
I
are.
identify as confused.
Yeah, time really means nothing. And
Yeah.
I understand that I was only in TEDx Mania for 2 weeks, but it feels like 9 months.
It like legit felt like several months of TEDx Mania.
Yeah.
Which it was
We're
in
back
terms
now.
of like prep, but
That's true. I know I realized on Friday that it was the first like weekend in months that I didn't have to work on memorizing anything. It was such a gift.
what a gift. Hey, everyone.
So we're going to kick off with empathy exercises as normal and then break into our topic of the day, which will introduce probably several more videos you will see on this channel because we're going to introduce you to the next Good Doctor's rabbit hole. And but first, let's kick it off with some empathy exercises. So here we are. Dr. Donnelly. Dr. Aaron, you want to take this one away?
I do, yeah. So this rather became a quick number one on our empathy exercise list for today, because as we were researching the topic for today's discussion, which is the troubled teen industry and institutional abuse, I came across the link that this month is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And so, and thus, we're, I believe that's why we're talking about Institutional Abuse Week this week as well. We'll get into that more in a mo, but important to have this website from the National
Network to End Domestic Violence.
National Network to End Domestic Violence. So lots of resources about the kind of advocacy work that's going on this month for Domestic Violence Awareness Month, all their activities, where you can get more information and where you can donate and help out. So make sure and check out that link. And, we talk about months all the time here on the Abbey Research platforms as a great opportunity to highlight something we should be talking about all year round, which we do. We talk about violence all the time.
And this is particularly prescient this year because of the Gabby Petito case, which is still in the headlines. Gabby was, by all evidence, a victim of domestic violence, if not for her ultimate demise at other times in her life. So this is or other times in the relationship. So this is particularly prescient at the moment.
It is, yes.
Number 2 is you as well.
Number 2 is me. I know. And I'm gonna have to bear with me, folks. Read as we scroll. So was really excited. Your Indian country correspondent is excited to tell you about this new Tulsa mural, and that's kind of exploring the intersection of being Black and Indigenous. And this is, in the spaces I frequent, a conversation that's happening a lot on Native Twitter, especially with the rise and the kind of like smash success of the show Reservation Dogs. There were a lot of critiques from the Black Indigenous community that the show was not representing the full spectrum of indigeneity. So really excited to see this mural by Pawnee artist Bunky Echo Hawk.
I'm really sad it's not Pawnee, Indiana, but I'll get over it.
And so it's really exciting to see this visual representation of this intersection take place. There's a great article from the local news source that we will share with y'all in the show notes, where you can read more about the portrayal of this and creation of this mural. I studied murals for my PhD. I love murals and public art, so always excited to see something like this happen. And shout out to what was his? I forgot his name already.
Bunky Echo Hawk.
That's it, Bunky Echo Hawk. Thanks, mate. Great job. Another reason we need to go to Tulsa. Oklahoma is like scaling up the lists for us in places we need to go. This particular artist has also done work for the First Americans Museum in Oklahoma City, which is also on our list, Dr. K, I know. So Oklahoma, look out. We're coming for you.
So this one's my turn to talk about Jon Gruden, which is just one of my least favorite topics to talk about, abusive football coaches, but evidently that falls to me today. For anyone who wasn't aware, Jon Gruden was well known for a long time of being a bully, at least, at best, and a serial abusive predator at worst in how he spoke to people. He coached for the team from Washington for a long time. He was recently traded to or recently quit that, fired that. I can't remember the exact details. And most recently was with the Las Vegas Raiders, which I still don't understand how they're always in Oakland in my, not get a new logo if you're changing cities. Don't do this to me.
So confusing.
But it's a lot of emails that he wrote that were leaked. It was a 7-year period. They are misogynistic. They are racist. They are homophobic. They are, I mean, honestly, like the bingo card of being a terrible human. he just hit bingo so often. So what's really interesting is that in the middle of his firing, which was great, nobody really paid attention to the Washington football team, who had been sounding calls for him to be fired. Like the cheerleaders and employees, not the players, but the cheerleaders and employees had been sounding calls for him to be fired for a long time. Mm-hmm. And so now the cheerleaders in particular are asking for more transparency and emails to be released among really the entire league. And we have been in other circumstances where we've heard professional American football cheerleaders explain how essentially exploitative their jobs are. They're not compensated appropriately. They are not even kept safe necessarily in walking to and from the stadiums. In some cases, they have to walk through very rabid drunk fans who believe that they are the property of the fans. It's not great. So people also deeply believe there are more of Jon Gruden's emails that could come out that would implicate other coaches and other members of the organizations that he worked for. So they are calling, they want more data. It's out there. Jon Gruden is not the only coach who behaved this way or the only NFL employee who behaved this way. So what I really love from the cheerleaders at the team from Washington is a recognition that the system enabled this. So let's get all the evidence for the whole system and let's go to town.
Yeah, which I think is really, really relevant, especially for us today. Next week on the YouTubes, we have coverage of the documentary about Harvey Weinstein that was on Hulu called Untouchable. And we recorded it today, and we spent a lot of time talking about how holding one individual accountable for their actions is not holding the system accountable. And if we don't hold the system accountable, we can't actually change going forward. So hopeful to see the NFL being held accountable as a system that allows these kinds of abuses to continue.
Speaking of change making.
Hey, let's do that. I know. Another exciting bit of news for Indian country. The moccasin maker Minnetonka has apologized for profiting off of Native culture. And this came to us last week. When we were in Chicago, and we were like, boy, do you know what we haven't spent a lot of time talking about? Cultural appropriation. I kid. We've actually talked about it. But this is a great opportunity to showcase growth. Are you reading that quote, or do you want me to? I see you.
No, I just highlighted it because that's his statement.
Okay.
I didn't want us to lose track of it. That's all.
Okay. Yeah. So we deeply and meaningfully apologize for having benefited from selling Native inspired designs without directly honoring Native culture. And I mean, that's the guts of what appropriation is, right? Right there. And there's a fantastic blog by academic and podcaster Adrienne Green called Native Appropriations, which we'll make sure and link in the show notes, where that's literally what she does. She just catalogs appropriations of Native culture. And it's the lack of recognition. It's the borrowing of a cultural idea or symbol without giving credit. There are places you can buy authentic moccasins from. You can buy them from indigenous moccasin makers. If you really flip and love moccasins, go to town. Make sure you're buying them from a source that is honoring the culture, not just profiting off of the image. So we don't know what Minnetonka is going to do from here, but we're always excited to see conversations about cultural appropriation and apologies for cultural appropriation in the news.
We're ending with a happy note from our beloved Northern Ireland, that there is a women's book club promoting reading to tackle perceptions around deprivation, which is very, 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 very prevalent within Northern Ireland. Kilcooly is very significant.
Yeah. This just came across the TL last week, and I said, you know what? We talk about Northern Ireland a lot. We don't talk about it always in a positive light, but delighted to see the Kilcooly Women's Center and their Duchess of Cornwall reading group, like named it after Camilla, which I love. It's very Kilcooly.
Very banger.
Very, very banger there to name it after the Duchess of Cornwall. But I encourage you to watch the video that's playing. The Camilla Club is what it's called. Lol, that's hilarious. Because it's such a wonderful short story about the power of books and the way they can bring people together, and you can explore different ideas and learn things about yourself and others. And it's what Dr. Kristen and I love so much about books. And we know the power that they've had over our lives and the lives of a lot of people we love. So delighted to see it taking place in the Camilla Club in Kilcooly. Shout out to Bangor.
Great job, Bangor.
Keep it up. Keep it up.
So that thus concludes the empathy exercises for today. We're going to move on now to something that we have been talking about for a long time, but not in a systemic or connected way that we are now going to be talking about it, and that is institutional abuse. So one of the very first YouTube videos we ever did was about the documentary series The Keepers, which is about the institutional abuse of the Catholic Archdiocese in Baltimore. Obviously, we have gone hoarse talking about Larry Nassar, and we have talked about the mother and baby homes in Ireland and
the Boy Scouts
and the residential schools for Indian children. And what came to our attention, we want to thank one of our viewers who has been incredibly helpful in email form, especially in pointing us to all of these incredible resources. And we will have her on the channel soon to talk about her experiences. But when we were talking last week about Britney Spears, we brought up Paris Hilton. And Paris Hilton spent time at a place called the Provo Canyon School. And she talks about it in her documentary and in some other videos that we'll be linking in the show notes as an incredibly traumatic and terrible experience that she still suffers PTSD from. And the Provo Canyon School is one of the schools that a lot of us know about all around the country, but have probably never really thought about, which are like correctional facilities for rich white kids.
Yeah, they're called like residential treatment schools, or
you have wilderness schools in that, and drug rehab stuff.
Yeah.
All together, it's called the troubled teen industry.
Yeah. Which, like, cool, that's an industry? Yeah. Great job, America.
So we have some questions and a couple of suggestions. But first of all, we want to be really clear that this is the beginning of a conversation for us as well. We were, in case you were wondering how we spent the day after my TEDx Chicago talk, it was lying on Dr. Aaron's bed and watching YouTube videos about cults and what cults did to start the troubled teen industry. So if you guys are ever concerned that not traveling less means that you're missing out on a good time, fear not. You're just missing out on cult YouTube videos. But the origins of this, as of this moment in popular knowledge, the origins of these start with a cult that was in the 1960s up into the early 90s, I think. I can't quite remember. Actually, there's still a branch in Germany. We got to follow up on that, called Synanon.
Yeah.
And you may have heard of Synanon. You may not have. Very recently, there was a book published by a musician, and he's escaping me. We'll put this in the show notes, who was raised in Synanon and escaped. And the memoir is him. I think it was a big memoir last year too. Time means nothing. I think it was last year. Sure. And he was on CBS Sunday Morning and everything else. And so you may have heard of Synanon in that context. Essentially what Synanon did that matters in this conversation is they normalized tough love as a therapeutic technique. I was glad to hear that, because as somebody who went through therapy, we were taught actively not to use it. So I was trying to figure out who was ever taught to use it.
Yeah, it was like, this, like, one of the documentaries we watched that really goes into the background of Synanon was like reiterating that this was not clinically verified or accepted.
It was just a guy who took the 12 steps and thought it didn't include enough public shaming.
But as we often know, like, these things can gain a lot of momentum, especially if they are deemed quote unquote successful. Yeah. And it really spiraled into this whole concept of how we deal with humans who are troubled, whether they are suffering from addiction, behavior abnormalities. I'm using air quotes for our dear podcast listeners. Any way in which you, this is the conclusion we came to when we were talking about it last week, any way in which you are perceived to deviate from societal norms, then you require an intervention. Mm-hmm. And we've seen, there's a whole list of things we can, gay conversion therapy falls under that umbrella. Certainly the troubled teen industry does. And, one of the documentaries we brought up made a really good point that it was all of these things. It was teens who might be struggling with drugs or alcohol or sex abuse, or it might be their parents' perceived understanding that, they're not performing to their expectations in school. Like, it could be a whole host of things. As long as it falls under this quote unquote deviant behavior, it justifies an intervention.
So we do know that for teenagers in the United States, teenagers of color, they are significantly more likely to be incarcerated. And we will be talking in future videos about the connection between incarceration and the troubled teen industry and kind of what that looks like. We haven't gotten a chance to dig in yet. But what I want to say is that as long as there has been society, there has been punishments for deviancy.
Yeah.
The reason that this in particular is such an interesting alchemy to us as social scientists is that we didn't really have an understanding of adolescence until the 50s, really. This kind of idealized adolescence that everyone assumes adolescents have is largely, and this is a crass overgeneralization, but you guys are used to them from me. Essentially, we decided what teenagers are because of Leave It to Beaver in a lot of ways. And it was teenagehood wasn't a thing until we had the post-war boom and the economic boom that came with it, that teenagers didn't have to go to work and could stay home after school. And not, you also have the emergence of household products to help people. The kids didn't have to do as many chores because there were vacuum cleaners now, and you didn't have to beat the rugs and all of these kind of things. And then in the middle of that, you have very strong reactions to counterculture. You have lots and lots of pearl clutching over what does it mean to be a good teenager or a bad teenager. And these schools start popping up all over the place, all over the United States in particular. One of the most famous ones you may have heard of is called the Elon School in Maine. The Dozier School for Boys in Florida is also very famous. Then, of course, Provo Canyon School. A quick Google search will get you a lot of these. Don't worry. And this week, as we're sitting in it, is in fact Institutional Abuse Awareness Week, because a huge part of the process of these schools that they learned from Synanon was cutting off communication from the outside world. So not only did they take tough love, but they took cutting off communication. And so the kids don't have access to stories or advocates until they're older necessarily. And so now we're getting a lot more movements of survivors of these schools speaking out. We should also say that there are rehab facilities that are clinically proven and run well and all of that. So the troubled teen industry is not to be painted with a brush, but in any way, shape, or form, if you are sending your child for psychiatric help to a place where there is not licensed facilities on campus, the real issue is that there's no regulation around this industry at all. There are no safety nets. There is nothing to make sure that any of these kids are safe, or that the people running it aren't using these kids as cash cows.
And you know, we're going to have a lot of links in the show notes. There are several organizations called Breaking Code Silence, which is a reference to code silence is when young people who are being held in these schools are like forced into solitary confinement, I believe.
Yes, essentially. Yeah, and they have to be silent contemplation. Yeah.
Yeah, it's called code silence. And so Breaking Code Silence has become the moniker for this movement, which is how we found out about it, how we found out that it was Institutional Abuse Awareness Week, because one of the incarnations of Breaking Code Silence on Facebook has a lot of posts about it. We'll share all the links. But it's really
and again our wonderful viewer who commented and shared with us. So
yes, that it all came from that. So there's a lot of discourse happening around this now. So there's in our show notes we have a short video that's a history of the troubled teen industry that goes into Synanon and how it evolved. And it's a horrifically fascinating. Yes, Jay, we agree with you. We are both flabbergasted as well. As people who study cultural evolutions, we were both fascinated to start tracking the rise in cults that happened in the United States in a particular moment in time in the 1970s, and the rise then in the troubled teen industry as you get into the 1980s and the moral majority and the conservative like push for all of this moral control, and the rise of incarceration rates and drug use and the prison, mass incarceration. All of it's connected in this way that neither Dr. Kristen or I had seen and or thought about before we started. Before Friday. And now you understand why it's our new rabbit hole, which is literally what I texted Dr. Kristen when I started looking into this stuff that our dear viewer had pointed us towards. There's also a video from Paris Hilton about the regulation of this, and about her journey to advocate for an organization that was pushing for regulation in the state of Utah, which they did get the bill passed in the state of Utah. And there is also a now national act that is working towards, again, creating regulation in an industry that has been very, very underregulated. It is the act concerning the placement of young children in congregate care facilities. So we'll have the link to that as well, and the background for that. It's so, we were encouraged to see a lot of space on the internet and a lot of discourse around what this is, but there's still such a lack of awareness and understanding that this is ongoing. Then it's not just happening to the Paris Hiltons who appear to be, privileged and unruly. And the cultural discourse that we have around these young folks as well is a huge part of the problem. I'm rabbit tailing again. So Dr. Kristen, Phil.
So what I think is particularly important for us to realize here is, again, I want to draw our attention back to however there has been society, there has been ways to punish deviancy. And we have always punished that deviancy by trying to correct the deviancy. Always. That has been forever. And for a long time, the deviancy was like literally being a woman. And so they just burned women at the stake. And there was, so there's a lot of things that we've always done this. So I don't want people to take this as this is a new thing that is really terrible. It is an evolved thing that is really terrible. But the more important question we would encourage you all who are listening and watching, hey, replay crew, hey, podcast crew, hey, pals who are with us right now, is to ask in your own life, what are ways that you seek to eliminate the deviancy of others? And I think this is a question we can be asking ourselves. There are definitely times that I looked at Paris Hilton and judged the living garbage out of her.
Oh, yeah.
And 100%, I was conditioned to do that by the media that told me to judge her. Yeah. And now I even find myself in conversations. I mean, like, gosh, I'm judgy sometimes for sure. And I'll have to sit there and think, is this actually something that matters? Is this way that I find them deviant a way that matters? Or is this a way that I'm just being petty and ridiculous? And this can be a increasing empathy exercise around the idea of deviancy, while we are also investigating this particular industrial complex within the United States. Yeah. There are some serious racial and class things here that we just know, but we haven't been able to quite trace the exact roots of yet. There are some significant differences even within the troubled teen industry. We have a gut feeling about who gets sent to what things. It would be much more likely for a court to order to boot camp, for instance, to a fake boot camp, than for a court to order to a wilderness program. That's our gut. We don't know if that's true. So we have to do some more digging, which is why we are excited to do that. Also because we adore digging and this kind of things. But when we sat there, one of the things we sat there on Friday and tried to do was like trace back to when we actually thought this started. Because everyone kept saying it was Synanon. And we're like, we don't think it is. Like, it didn't come out of the lotus flower in the 60s. Like, that's not how this works. So we kept going back. And I think we finally got back to like Victorian workhouses.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that's challenging about this. Is because a lot of times when we talk about these things, we give the appearance that they came out of nowhere or that they came out of somewhere specific. I think certainly Victorian workhouses, as soon as we started, differentiating between incarceration and people who needed to be removed from society.
And then also that children were allowed to be separated from their clan.
Yeah.
So you have to have the birth of the nuclear family to get this. You have to have the separation of common areas.
Sure.
So then, because you never separated a child from the clan before, but you could separate them from their family because
and like private home spaces that were for the nuclear family.
And that's when you really start to get the radical class differences too.
Yeah.
And you have deviancy treated at different times. So again, you guys can. This is like we had this conversation over cocktails.
And I think the other point that we talked about that we haven't done any research into, but is worth bringing up, just to say we see similarities and to say we're going to look into them as well, is we've spent a lot of time on our socials recently talking about Indian residential schools, both in the United States and in Canada, and they were created roughly around the same time that we start to get the idea of workhouses. mid to late 19th century. And the person who was like, is considered to be one of the founding fathers behind the idea of residential schools had the phrase, kill the Indian, save the child. And it's not that hard to say. So, that's a very specific statement, where they were removing the Indian from their culture, from their family, from everything that they knew, and like quote unquote deprogramming them, taking that cultural aspect, taking out that part of their identity. Replace deviancy. So what was deviant about those Indian children, according to broader society, was that they were Indian. You can take that phrase and apply it to any form of perceived deviancy and say, like, this is what we're doing it to save the child, or to save the human, or whatever.
The thing that gets particularly grievous to me in this is that there are kids caught up in the system that desperately need help.
Yeah. And
that have brains that need chemical rebalancing, or have come from incredibly traumatic and abusive experiences that need spaces to heal. And the schools that are abusive in this have no interest in doing any of that. They have interest in controlling and eliminating the deviancy. And when we have allowed, by the lack of regulation in the United States, and I should say there's lots of people who generally need, especially teenagers, who genuinely need help and are sent into juvenile incarceration. So it's a both. We do not know how to treat teenagers who don't look like an Archie comic in the United States.
Yeah.
If you're not on the honor society, we don't know what to do with you. And so we want to shove you away and fix you into a Stepford child as soon as possible. And that we are failing children is, as a former youth worker, I nearly tore a pillow in half watching a couple of these videos, thinking about how many people I know. Youth work is also an incredibly unregulated industry, like youth work in general. How many people I know that genuinely want to help kids and then end up in situations like this and get taught that this is how you help them.
Yeah.
And they're in adolescent psychology is already complicated enough without treating children like punching bags with money in their eyes.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I think as you guys have gotten a sense over the last 20 odd minutes, this is a exceptionally complicated issue. It's very layered. We don't know all the layers yet, as you've seen. Like, we wanted to talk about this because we wanted to bring attention to it, especially during Institutional Abuse Awareness Week. But you're also kind of seeing live into our thought process as we're processing our way through understanding what this system is, why it exists, what the infrastructure is, and how we can start to dismantle it. It's very, very messy, but it is, as I think, really important to say, even once again, what Dr. Kristen has said several times, this is not new. We have been treating perceived societal deviancy in this way for a very long time, in different ways, through different mechanisms and treatments. And then this is the current manifestation of it for young people who, whatever is going on in their lives, appear to be in some kind of crisis and are not being served in a way that benefits them as a human being.
Absolutely. And now we have a lot better understanding than when these schools started, and honestly, just forever, about adverse child experiences and how we say, so many of these kids are in pain, just flat out pain, and what that looks like. And we have a lot of things to do. So I've dropped a link in the YouTube show notes right now, here in the comments, I should say, and it will be in the show notes as well. As we do this exploration, we would love to have you sign up for our newsletter, because that is going to be the best place to hear some of our most up-to-date thoughts on it. And if we're going to have other opportunities to talk about it in a video format, you're going to find out about that on the newsletter. So we want to make sure we've been not as vocal about the newsletter here on the YouTubes as we should have been, but it truly is the best place to know what we're talking about and why. So we'd really love for you to sign up for that. And it will be in the show notes of both the podcast and the YouTube whenever you are watching or consuming this.
Yeah.
In closing, what I would like to say, former youth worker hat on, reporter from Youth Work. What is like your Youth Work land correspondent?
Youth Work correspondent. Yeah.
Youth Work correspondent. Teenagers are hard because they don't know their own bodies, because their body doesn't know their own bodies. There are so many hormones and cultural things and genetic things, and it's hard. It's so hard. And what I have consistently told parents throughout my career is that we can generally fix everything except a kid not knowing they're loved. So if you're a parent watching this and you are terrified, which I know this can all be very overwhelming and weird, the best advice that we can give you to combat any level of pain that your kids are in is let them know that they're loved.
Amen, sister. Thank you, youth correspondent, Dr. Kristen. We've hit almost all the correspondents except for Jesus Land correspondent, which I'm sure we could bring you in for something.
Yeah, I mean, this. Yes, there's some definite, we haven't even touched on the evangelicals that run some of these schools. So don't worry, that's coming.
That's coming. But I think that's a wrap on our Good Doctors Diagnose for today. Sending out healing thoughts and love to victims and survivors of institutional abuse, and those who are struggling for recognition for what happened to them in the troubled teen industry. And next up, lest you think we're hopping around to another delightful topic, next week we're going to be breaking down diet culture. The religiosity of it, the gender of it, the class of it. Oh boy, folks. Come along next week. We are doing it in tandem with a documentary on
HBO Max.
On HBO Max called The Way Down. Yes?
I think so. If you Google like weight loss documentary, we'll link it in the show notes.
It's
Gwen Shamblin and The Way Down Workshop. You'll recognize her by her hair.
We talk a lot about body image, body positivity, body neutrality, recognition and representation, all sorts of those things on this channel. So we're digging into a particular part of Dr. Kristen's past, as she is so generous with her experiences with y'all. So watch The Way Down, or whatever it's called, in the interim, so that next week you can come rant with us about diet culture.
Can't wait. In the meantime, we hope that you are well and safe and know in your bones that you are loved.
Take care, everybody.